In May 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. Hitler and other Nazi figures were dead, and German soldiers were exhausted after almost 6 years of fighting. For many of them, it was a relief to lay down their arms. They could finally return home and to the arms of their families. However, not everyone felt the same way. Certain groups of German fighters continued to carry out the Führer's last orders, which encouraged them to fight until the last drop of blood. Even though there was no way to achieve the longed-for victory, these Germans continued with violence and barbarism through guerrilla operations and surprise attacks. Peace was still far from coming to the destroyed European country. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the renegade Nazi fighters who continued to fight even after the end of the war. By the beginning of 1945, almost everyone could feel that the end of the war was approaching. Adolf Hitler's forces were surrounded by both the Western Allies and the Soviets. Both armies were advancing rapidly into German territory, while the enemy forces offered increasingly weak resistance. In April of that year, when the Red Army reached the gates of Berlin, there was no doubt who would emerge victorious. One of the few who did not share this opinion was the Führer himself. He and his most ardent fans still believed that Germany was capable of defeating its rivals, even as Stalin's artillery destroyed the buildings of its capital. Despite his unfounded illusion, Hitler knew that he had to make drastic decisions to ensure the future of his Reich. One of them was to increase the number of combatants. By 1945, the most veteran Nazi troops, those who had won battles and conquered countries in the previous years, had died or been captured by the enemy. Those who remained were inexperienced young men or weak old men, poorly equipped to defend the nation. They either fell like flies before the advance of the Allies, or preferred to surrender when they saw defeat so close. It was for these reasons that the Nazi hierarchy devised the deployment of forces outside the line army. Thus were born the werewolf units, which were ordered to carry out a guerrilla war against the invaders. They were to operate behind the lines and through sabotage, espionage, and assassination, slow down the progress of the Americans, the British, and the Soviets. Many of the members of this organization were teenagers from the Hitler Youth, the official Nazi Youth Association. Before the war turned against Germany, these children had been classified as too young to be sent to fight at the front. But the current situation was different. Even though they were 15 years old, even younger in some cases, a rifle was placed in their hands, and they were given their orders, sending them to almost certain death. They were not expected to survive, but were simply expected to do enough damage to the enemy to organize the German defenses. The female population of the country, which had stayed out of the fighting, was also used in these dangerous operations. For Hitler, the concept of civilians no longer existed. Everyone had to do their part to defend the Reich. But these missions were never as successful as expected. By the end of the war, the equipment they had was insufficient, as the best weapons were sent to the war front to be used against the enemies. In addition, the morale of the combatants was at rock bottom. Fewer and fewer people saw final victory as possible. Even Hitler was no longer deluding himself. The Soviets were slowly approaching his underground bunker in Berlin, while desperate defenders were dying or deserting. The German leader was beginning to think about finding a way out. Still, he left clear orders to the members of the Werewolf. They were to continue their sabotage actions, even if Germany signed the surrender. The Führer believed that if they could mobilize the country's population, they would be able to expel the invaders. However, he would not be around to see it happen. On April 30th, with the Red Army within meters of their hideout, Hitler and his wife Eva Braun decided to take their own lives. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's propaganda minister and another of the creators of the werewolf, followed in their footsteps the next day. Before dying, he reiterated his instructions to the generals who were still alive to continue fighting until the bitter end. But these soldiers did not share the Nazi fanaticism of their leaders. After a week of weak resistance, On May 8, 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender.
In the city of Reims, once under the German heel, stands the schoolhouse where the terms of unconditional surrender are to be signed. The German delegation, headed by General Jodl, Germany's Chief of Staff, have arrived for the fateful ceremony. The General puts his signature to the document, which acknowledges the complete defeat of the German armed forces by those of Britain, Russia, and the United States.
Berlin was occupied by the Soviets, who were joined by the Americans, the British, and the French shortly afterwards. All the German soldiers remaining in the capital were searched and their weapons confiscated. Most, either hopeless or relieved by the end of the fighting, did not put up any resistance. The same thing happened in other parts of Europe that were still under German control, such as different cities in Germany, Austria, or even supposedly neutral countries such as Spain. But there were certain divisions that did decide to obey Hitler's last orders. These groups escaped to the mountainous areas of the country, such as Bavaria, from where they would plan their counterattack. Most of these units belonged to the Schutzstaffel, better known as the SS. They were the most important paramilitary organization within the National Socialist Party, and also by far the most brutal. Its members were in charge of security in the concentration and extermination camps, where millions were murdered. In addition, they had death squads that carried out thousands of massacres of civilians in the conquered territories. The list of crimes committed by SS members was extremely long. Only the cruelest and most fanatical of the Nazis were accepted into their ranks. For this reason, it is not surprising that some isolated units of this organization refused to surrender along with the rest of the regular army. Outside of fanaticism, many officers knew that the atrocious war crimes they had committed guaranteed them hanging if they were captured. The brutalities carried out by the Germans in the concentration camps were becoming increasingly known, and survivors demanded that justice be done to the perpetrators. Faced with the situation of having to face this punishment, several SS members decided to continue a war that was already totally lost. Even before the German surrender on May 8th, bizarre situations arose between this organization and the rest of Germany. On the 3rd of that same month, a small American division was preparing to attack Itter Castle, located in Austria, near the Dachau concentration camp. The building had been converted into a prison for high-value French detainees, such as former ministers and military commanders. Even Charles de Gaulle's sister was there. SS soldiers, who still held on to the idea that Germany could win the war, guarded the castle. Their latest orders were to defend their position to the end. They could use the prisoners as hostages to negotiate favorable terms. But if the situation became untenable, they were allowed to massacre them. One of these captives had managed to escape and asked the Americans for help. Knowing that the lives of the detainees were in danger, they agreed to his pleas. The first Allied attempts to take the castle were repelled and forced to retreat. Still, the SS commander there, seeing that his position was not as safe as he had first thought, began to fear for his life and retreated with his men. The building was taken over by the now free French prisoners of war, but they still did not feel safe. They knew that there was a strong Nazi presence in the area, and they feared that they would take reprisals against them. The captives, in turn, managed to extend their request for help to the Austrian resistance. Among them was a unit of the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, who had disobeyed orders to continue fighting. They decided to change sides and confront the SS men. The Schutzstaffel forces shot anyone who made clear their intentions to surrender. Sometimes they even massacred the male population without any proof, since anyone could be a deserter in their eyes. This was the situation that led the Germans to join the Americans in defending the castle, waving a white flag to demonstrate their peaceful intentions. The Allies immediately accepted the help. On May 5th, approximately 150 fanatical SS soldiers began the attack. Their opponents were 35 men, including Allies, Germans, and French, who also had a functional tank. However, the battleship was quickly put out of action by Nazi artillery.
SS troops now surged forward in a general assault on the castle. The firing from both sides was intense. French VIPs Renard, Clemenceau, Larocque and Borotre also armed themselves and joined in the fight.
The defenders tried to call for help from nearby American units, but their means of communication were destroyed before they could make their position clear. A French tennis player who had been held prisoner in the castle volunteered to run among the attackers and transmit the rest of the message. Thanks to him, almost 10 hours after the offensive began, reinforcements arrived and completely surrounded the SS men. Approximately 100 were captured, while the rest lay dead. Only one defender was killed in combat, the leader of the rebellious German unit. In this unique conflict, Germans and Allies joined forces to fight together against a common enemy. It was also one of the last battles fought in Europe, since, as we mentioned, 3 days later, the Third Reich signed the surrender. Despite this, the violence continued. Led by renegade SS men, groups of Germans continued to demonstrate against the occupation troops located within their territory. These attacks were concentrated mostly in the area inhabited by the American Army, in southern Germany and western Austria. But they were not limited to the country where Nazism was born. They also occurred in northern Italy, near the Austrian border. Between May 9, 1945, the day after the Germans laid down their arms, and the end of December 1948, almost 400 incidents were recorded. 50 Americans died as a result, and 200 more were wounded. For more than 3 years, this group of staunch Nazi Germans sought to keep the flame of war alive. The attackers justified their actions by the crimes committed by some of the occupying soldiers. The Soviets, for example, abused hundreds of thousands of German women during their march towards Berlin. Thirsty for blood and revenge for the atrocities committed by the Nazis on their own territory, for many of them there were no innocent Germans. They were all guilty of bringing death into their homes. The Western Allies, in turn, were not clean in this regard. In the second half of 1945, with peace declared in Europe, sexual crimes increased enormously. Many were punished by a military court, but it was also common for superiors to simply look the other way or even justify rapes. They believed that it was their right as the victorious side.
After the fighting moved on to German soil, there was a good deal of assault by combat troops and those immediately following them. The incidents varied between unit and unit according to the attitude of the commanding officer. In some cases, offenders were identified, tried by court-martial and punished. The army legal branch was reticent, but admitted that for the brutal or perverted offences against German women, some soldiers had been shot, particularly if they happened to be black soldiers.
The attacks were not only directed against the Allied occupiers, but also against German civilians, who were identified as enemy sympathizers. These people had collaborated with the Americans, revealing information or serving as witnesses to crimes. The Nazis did not forgive them. A few active werewolf members also took part in these punitive missions. They camouflaged themselves among the population in order to pounce on their targets when they were unaware. For many of these attackers, these actions were preemptive in nature. They were certain that the surviving Jews, once resettled in their homes, would take revenge on them for the brutalities committed by the Nazis. They were also concerned about what would happen to displaced people from Eastern Europe, such as Poles and Russians, whose towns had been reduced to rubble by the Germans. Several of these were on German soil, and had every reason to want to vent their anger on the perpetrators of their misfortunes. Goebbels's propaganda machine was still alive and well, even though he was no longer there, and the milieu he had emboldened against these peoples continued to fill the minds of German citizens. Many believed that the Allied occupation forces would allow Jews and Slavs to plunder businesses at will, without any form of punishment. and so they preferred to strike first. Although these fears proved unfounded in the months following the surrender, not all Nazi sympathizers were able to give up their convictions, and violence continued. The occupation troops had to deal with this problem. Due to the chaos and destruction caused by the war, Germany was in complete ruins. The resources sent by the Allies, such as food and medicine, were not enough for everyone. Some, desperate at the situation, decided to turn to crime. Despite the invaders' attempts to demilitarize the country, weapons were still abundant due to so many years of fighting. Many of these ended up in the hands of people who had no problem robbing other citizens to get what they needed. They often organized themselves into small gangs that terrorized the locals and sometimes even attacked Allied soldiers. Although not all of them were affiliated with Nazism, many were sympathetic to the cause and received help from fugitive SS members to continue their operations. The month of May 1945 was the period where this problem developed the most. Just 3 days after the German surrender, 2 American soldiers were murdered by members of the paramilitary organization. Their bodies were left in plain sight as a warning to the invaders. The Americans carried out an intense search of the area. They subjected the inhabitants of the town to brutal interrogation, but were unsuccessful. The Germans managed to escape. In the middle of the month, a bomb detonated at a command post. 22 soldiers were injured. In the following days, other Americans were attacked by snipers hiding among the vegetation and rocks. The Allies always organized responses to find the perpetrators, but the Germans, knowing the terrain, were usually able to evade them quickly. On May 25th, the most important attack took place in an Austrian town called Zell am See. 21 SS soldiers suddenly attacked the American occupation forces. Although they were well equipped for the offensive, the Americans were already more prepared for such operations and managed to repel them without suffering any casualties. Nevertheless, the Germans managed to escape with their unit almost intact. Only one of them was caught and taken prisoner.
Sporadic reports of SS in the Bavarian mountains continued to be received by the US authorities. On the 21st of July 1945, the bridge at Unken, Zell am See, near Salzburg in Austria, was partly demolished by an explosive charge planted by SS troops thought to be skulking in the hills and mountains thereabouts. This was the last attack attributed directly to renegade SS troops.
Operations against the occupiers continued, but as the months passed, they lost steam. They were nowhere near achieving their goal of driving out the Allies. The Allies, for their part, stopped organizing missions to capture them, as they did not see them as a threat. Most of these fugitive SS were never captured, but they never attacked again either. It is believed that over the years they simply disbanded and decided to return to civilian life, eventually accepting defeat. Despite their fears of retribution for crimes committed during the war, most of them ended their days in peace, never being put on trial. By the early 1950s, the country was largely at peace. The economic situation was improving rapidly, unemployment was falling, and little of the ideology of Nazism remained among its citizens, at least publicly. As the years went by, the occupiers began to reduce their control and influence in the country, and the fears of retaliation expressed by certain Germans turned out to be unfounded. All these reasons resulted in the last signs of violence from World War II finally disappearing. And so we come to the end of the video, and we want to ask you, do you think that if they had been better organized, the SS attacks could have achieved their goal? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.